the German Navy's secret mutiny that shocked Hitler. In the final months of the Second World War, Hitler's empire was collapsing from within. Cities lay in ruins, the skies burned red with Allied firebombs, and across Europe, the Nazi war machine was being crushed from every direction. Yet among the chaos and defeat, a different kind of battle was quietly beginning, one that would not be fought with tanks or bombs, but with conscience. In the cold naval ports of northern Germany, sailors of the Kriegsmarine waited for orders. They were the last remnants of a once mighty navy that had once ruled the seas with fear and precision. Now they stood surrounded by the sound of distant artillery and the eerie silence that comes when hope has already died. They knew the war was lost. Everyone did. But still, the orders kept coming. Orders to fight, to die, to destroy. Among these sailors was a 23-year-old radio operator named Matthias Kessler. His uniform was worn, his eyes hollow, and his hands trembled as he decoded a message from Berlin. The message bore a single word that would change everything: Regenbogen, rainbow. It was the code name for Operation Rainbow, Hitler's final naval order. The command was simple and absolute. Every German warship still afloat was to be destroyed before it could fall into Allied hands. Every submarine, every destroyer, every vessel scuttled, sunk, erased from existence. For the officers who still worshipped the Führer, it was an honorable end, a way to deny the enemy their victory. But to the men who had spent years risking their lives aboard those ships, it was madness. They had seen enough death, enough senseless sacrifice. They knew that by following this order, they would be condemning themselves and their comrades to die for a cause that no longer existed. Kessler read the message twice, then 3 times. Around him, the room was silent except for the hum of the radio. His commanding officers signed the order without hesitation. But something inside Kessler broke. He thought of his brother killed on the Eastern Front, his mother who had died in an air raid, the comrades who had been lost to the freezing Atlantic. For what? For an empire that was already dust.
Outside, the docks were a ghost town of steel and smoke. Ships sat moored in the harbor, silent and still. Their crews waited for orders they did not want to follow. Some whispered that surrender was coming, that the war would end in days. Others warned that any man who disobeyed an order from Berlin would be shot for treason. And so, in that heavy silence, the men began to make a choice. Aboard the destroyer Z-43, Lieutenant Otto Bauer gathered his men in the engine room. He spoke quietly, his voice shaking. "The war is over," he said. "We all know it. Berlin is burning. There is no reason to die now." The men looked at one another, torn between fear and relief. They had served under him for years. They had trusted him in storms, in battles, in moments of pure terror. And now, once more, they trusted him. That night, the first whispers of rebellion began to move through the fleet. Sailors refused to load ammunition. Engines were left cold. Messages were delayed, changed, or simply never sent. The rebellion did not begin with gunfire. It began with silence.
As night fell over Kiel, a single signal light blinked across the harbor. 3 short flashes, 2 long, then 1 short. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than routine communication. But to those who knew, it was the sign they had been waiting for, the signal of defiance. The mutiny had begun. The signal lights cut through the night like sparks of rebellion. 3 short flashes, 2 long, 1 short. It was small, almost invisible against the fog drifting across the harbor, but for those who watched from the decks of their ships, it was everything. It was the beginning. On board the destroyer Z-43, Lieutenant Otto Bauer stood with his men in the engine room, their faces lit by the dull orange glow of lanterns. The air smelled of oil and rust, heavy with anticipation. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The decision had already been made. At exactly midnight, Bauer gave a simple order: cut the power. The engines fell silent. The vibrations that had lived within the ship for years, the heartbeat of steel, vanished. Above deck, officers shouted, confused by the sudden blackout. But before anyone could react, the sailors moved. They locked the hatches, sealed the bridge, and took control. Within minutes, Z-43 was no longer under command of the Reich. It was under the command of its crew. For the first time in years, they were free men. Across the harbor, the same thing was happening. On the cruiser Prince Eugen, sailors refused to man their guns. On a U-boat preparing to dive, the chief engineer destroyed the ignition keys and declared the submarine unfit for combat. And in a small coastal patrol ship, a young captain threw his sidearm into the sea, saying only, "No more orders from ghosts." The mutiny spread like wildfire, quietly, invisibly, dangerously. Word traveled from ship to ship through whispers, through hand signals, through glances exchanged in the dark. Each man understood what was at stake. If they failed, they would be executed. But if they succeeded, they might live long enough to see the end of the war. By dawn, the port of Kiel was no longer a place of obedience. It was a powder keg.
When the officers realized what was happening, it was already too late. Some tried to rally the loyalists, to retake control by force. But the sailors had the advantage. They were everywhere, and they knew the ships better than anyone. Engines were sabotaged, communication lines cut, ammunition hidden or thrown overboard. Within hours, entire vessels were immobilized. In the command building overlooking the harbor, Admiral Hans Reuter received a call that made his blood run cold. "Sir," said the officer on the other end, "the Z-43 is no longer responding to orders. The men have taken the ship." Reuter froze. A mutiny? Here, in the Kriegsmarine? It was unthinkable. He barked into the receiver, demanding to know who was responsible. The answer came after a long pause. "All of them, sir. The entire crew." For a moment, the admiral said nothing. Then he hung up and stared out the window at the fog-covered sea. Somewhere out there, the navy he had spent his life building was tearing itself apart. Meanwhile, Kessler sat in his radio bunker, intercepting frantic messages from one ship after another. Some begged for help. Others cursed their men as traitors. One message sent from a loyal destroyer ended abruptly with a single word: fire. Gunfire echoed across the docks. The first blood of the mutiny had been spilled. Aboard the Z-43, Bauer heard the distant reports and knew the rebellion could not stay hidden any longer. He gathered his men on deck. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rising above the wind. "What we've done tonight, we've done for one reason: to live. Not to betray Germany, but to save what's left of it. The war is over, but our conscience is not. Remember that." Some nodded. Others stared at the sea, unable to speak. The enormity of what they had done pressed down on them like the weight of the ocean itself.
As the sun rose over the harbor, the full scale of the mutiny came into view. Nearly a dozen ships were now in the hands of their crews. Flags of the Reich hung lifeless in the wind, untouched. The harbor that had once echoed with drills and commands now stood eerily silent, save for the cry of gulls circling overhead. In Berlin, the reports began to reach the Führer bunker. Hitler's staff dismissed them at first as Allied propaganda, lies meant to sow confusion. But when confirmation came from the Navy High Command itself, panic followed. Hitler's rage was immediate and absolute. He screamed that the Navy was filled with cowards, that traitors had infected even the heart of the rank. He ordered that every man involved be executed without trial, but by then, control was already lost. In Kiel, a small band of sailors made a desperate choice. They would not surrender to Hitler's SS. They would not flee. They would hold their ground until the Allies arrived. And if the Gestapo came for them, they would fight back, not as Nazis, not as soldiers, but as men who had chosen freedom over fear. That night, the first Gestapo trucks rolled into the naval base. Black uniforms stepped out into the mist, their boots echoing on the docks. The hunt for the mutineers had begun. And deep in the radio bunker, Matthias Kessler whispered into the transmitter, sending a coded message not to Berlin, but to the approaching Allied forces. A message that would change everything. He spoke quietly, with steady hands, and when it was done, he leaned back and exhaled for the first time in days. The message was short, only 5 words.
By dawn, a heavy fog blanketed the harbor. The world seemed drained of color. Gray ships against gray water, their reflections swallowed by mist. For a few fragile hours, the mutineers believed they had bought themselves peace. But peace, in Hitler's Germany, was an illusion that never lasted. The first sign of trouble came with the low growl of truck engines. The Gestapo had arrived. Black uniformed officers poured into the docks like shadows given form. They moved with ruthless precision, weapons drawn, eyes sharp, faces blank. Their orders were simple: find the ringleaders, crush the rebellion, and make an example of every man who dared question the Führer's command. Matthias Kessler heard the trucks long before he saw them. From his radio bunker, he could feel the vibrations through the concrete floor. He turned off the transmitter and hid the coded log beneath a loose floor panel. The message had already gone out. The Allies would receive it soon, if they hadn't already. But now came the hard part: surviving long enough for it to matter. He looked at his reflection in the small metal mirror nailed to the wall. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale from exhaustion. He wasn't a hero, he told himself. He was just tired of death. Outside, on the destroyer Z-43, Lieutenant Bauer stood on the deck, watching the Gestapo trucks roll in. He knew what they were here for. They'll start with the officers, he murmured to his men. They'll want to know who gave the order. They'll torture the truth out of someone. One of the sailors swallowed hard. What do we do? Bauer stared out at the horizon, where faint flashes of artillery could be seen in the distance, the Soviets drawing closer with each passing hour. He said, "We hold the line, and if we can't, then we make sure they never get the ships." That morning, the Gestapo moved methodically from ship to ship, demanding answers. Those who cooperated were beaten. Those who didn't were shot on sight. The docks became a silent battlefield, a place where loyalty and fear collided in every glance, every breath.
At noon, Admiral Reuter was summoned from his office. He was furious, not at the mutineers, but at the chaos. He ordered immediate arrests, declaring martial law within the port. Posters went up overnight. Any man refusing orders will be executed. But the threat no longer had meaning. The men had already crossed the line. Once you defied Hitler, death was no longer the worst thing that could happen. By evening, smoke began to rise from the far end of the harbor. The Gestapo had discovered the first rebel stronghold, a warehouse where mutineers had stored food and medical supplies. They surrounded it, shouting for the men inside to surrender. But instead of surrendering, the sailors opened fire. The first exchange of gunfire between German soldiers and German sailors echoed across the harbor like thunder. The mutiny was no longer secret. It was war. Inside the warehouse, Bauer's men fought desperately, using overturned crates for cover. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not broken. "They'll kill us all," one shouted. "Then we take as many of them as we can," Bauer replied, loading his rifle. Meanwhile, Kessler slipped through the back streets of Kiel, keeping to the shadows. He could hear the gunfire in the distance and knew the mutiny was collapsing. But his mission wasn't over. The Allies had to receive the message. If they knew the fleet would not resist, they could take the ports without bloodshed. He moved quickly, ducking through alleyways, heading toward a small transmitter hidden in the ruins of an old church. Inside the crumbling nave, Kessler found another sailor, an old friend named Franz Muller, waiting beside the backup radio. Muller had a deep gash on his forehead and blood on his sleeve. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Kessler replied. "We need to resend the signal, stronger this time." They worked in silence, their fingers moving over the dials and switches. Outside, artillery thundered from the outskirts of the city. The Allies were closer now, close enough that the ground itself trembled with every blast. Finally, the signal went out again, a single repeating code pulsing into the airwaves. "The German fleet will not fight. The ports are open."
Then the door burst open. 2 Gestapo officers stormed in, guns raised. Müller turned, shouting for Kessler to run, but the shots came too fast. Müller fell instantly, a dark stain spreading across the stone floor. Kessler ducked behind the console, his ears ringing. He grabbed the transmitter, ripped out the coil, and smashed the glass tube with the butt of his pistol. The room went dark. Footsteps approached. "Hands up!" one of the officers shouted. But when they stepped closer, they found the room empty. Kessler had vanished into the shadows. Outside, night had fallen again. Flames licked the sky above the harbor. The Z-43 was burning, the Prinzeugen listing heavily to one side. The Kriegsmarine, the pride of the Reich, was eating itself alive. In Berlin, Hitler received the final report just after midnight. Entire squadrons were refusing to fight. Several ships had been sabotaged. The Kiel harbor was in chaos. His hand shook as he read, "Cowards, they will all hang." But there was no time left for executions. The Soviets were already on the outskirts of the capital. The world was closing in. In the chaos of those final days, no one knew what became of Matthias Kessler. Some said he escaped, surrendering to the British near Lübeck. Others claimed he was captured and executed in secret, his name erased from every record. But one thing was certain, his message had reached its destination. When Allied forces entered the German ports days later, they found ships abandoned, flags lowered, and men waiting to surrender without resistance. The German fleet had stood down. And though few would ever know his name, Kessler's signal had saved thousands of lives, German and Allied alike.
The mutiny had failed to overthrow Hitler, but it had done something far greater. It had proven that even in the darkest heart of the Reich, conscience still existed. When the smoke cleared over Kiel, the harbor looked like the aftermath of a nightmare. Ships that had once gleamed with discipline and precision now floated half-submerged in oily water. Some burned silently, their flames reflected in the waves like dying embers. Others lay abandoned, hatches open, decks scattered with rifles, boots, and blood. The mutiny had lasted less than 48 hours, but in that short time it had done what no Allied bombing raid could. It had shattered the last illusion of unity within Hitler's war machine. At dawn, a soft rain began to fall, washing the ash from the air. Lieutenant Otto Bowers stood on what remained of the Z-43's deck, staring at the gray horizon. His men were gone, some killed in the fighting,
others captured by the Gestapo. The ship itself was dying, listing heavily to port, its hull torn open by shell fire. The smell of smoke, salt, and death hung heavy in the air. He thought of what they had tried to do, of the moment they had dared to say no to orders that made no sense. He wondered if it had been worth it. He looked down at his reflection in the slick black water and saw not a soldier, not a traitor, but something in between. A man caught between duty and decency, between what he had been told to be and what he knew was right. Behind him, the crack of rifle fire echoed from the docks. The Gestapo were still hunting the survivors, but Bauer didn't run. He had made his peace. As the sound drew closer, he whispered a single word under his breath. Enough. Then he turned and walked toward the shore. Elsewhere in the city, Matthias Kessler moved through the ruins like a ghost. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His uniform was torn, his face smeared with soot. The radio in his pack was silent now, its battery dead, but it didn't matter. The message was out. He had heard the faint reply before the Gestapo found him. The Allies had received it. He crossed through streets littered with rubble, past crumbling buildings and abandoned vehicles. The sky above was a dull gray, filled with the distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the war was ending.
In Berlin, Hitler sat in his bunker, staring at maps that no longer mattered. The reports from Kiel lay scattered on his desk, ink smeared by his shaking hands. The word mutiny appeared again and again, underlined and red. He read it as if by staring long enough he could erase it. But even the Führer could not deny what had happened. His voice broke the silence, hoarse and bitter. "The Navy has betrayed me," he said. "They are all cowards." No one dared to answer. Around him, the bunker had become a tomb of silence and fear. Officers whispered of surrender, but no one spoke the word aloud. Hitler would rather burn Germany to ashes than see it fall into enemy hands. And so, while the world outside collapsed, he planned his own destruction. Back in Kiel, the rebellion's remnants were fading fast. The Gestapo had taken control of the docks. Bodies of mutineers lay where they had fallen, unburied, nameless. Those who survived were rounded up, beaten, and sent to makeshift holding cells in the basements of naval offices. Bauer was among them. His face was swollen, his uniform ripped, but he refused to speak. When the interrogator demanded names, he said nothing. When they asked why he had done it, he simply answered, because someone had to. For that, he was sentenced to death. But the execution never came. 2 days later, British forces reached the outskirts of Kiel. The sound of their tanks thundered through the city, and the Gestapo fled in panic. The war was over before the sentence could be carried out. When the British entered the harbor, they expected resistance. They found none. The German ships lay still, their guns unmanned, their flags lowered. The surviving sailors stood on deck, heads bowed, weapons discarded. A British officer later wrote in his report, "It was the strangest sight I have ever seen. The enemy did not surrender. They simply stopped being the enemy." Among the prisoners brought in that day was Matthias Kessler. He was found in the ruins of a church, unconscious, his radio beside him. The British doctor who examined him noted that his hands were badly burned, likely from damaged equipment. When asked who he was, he only replied,
No one.
But when Allied intelligence began reviewing intercepted signals, they discovered the broadcast sent from Kiel days earlier, the message that had told them the German fleet would not fight. The signal was traced back to Kessler's transmitter. Without it, the Allies might have launched a full assault on the naval ports, costing thousands of lives on both sides. He never spoke of it. After the war, a small number of surviving mutineers were quietly released. Most faded into anonymity, blending into the ruins of post-war Germany. The new government, desperate to rebuild, had no desire to publicize stories of rebellion within its own ranks. The word mutiny became taboo, buried beneath decades of silence. But the truth endured. In diaries, in whispers, in the memories of the men who had been there. Years later, in 1959, a British historian researching naval archives uncovered fragments of coded messages from the last days of the war. One caught his attention, a brief unsigned transmission repeating a single phrase in German. Die Flotte wird nicht kämpfen. The fleet will not fight. It was dated April 28, 1945. By that time, Hitler was already preparing for his final act in Berlin, and the navy he had once called the pride of the Reich was gone, not destroyed by enemy bombs, but undone by its own conscience. In the end, the rebellion at Kiel changed nothing in the course of history, and yet it changed everything. It did not stop the fall of Germany. It did not save the Reich. But it proved, in the dying hours of a monstrous war, that even among the ranks of those who had served it, humanity had not been completely extinguished. In a war defined by blind obedience, a handful of men had dared to disobey. And though the world forgot their names, the sea did not.
Because somewhere in the cold waters of the Baltic, the wrecks of those ships still rest, silent monuments to the night when the German Navy turned against its master, and the echo of their defiance drifted into history like a final breath of freedom. The war was over. The guns fell silent, the banners of the Reich were torn down, and the echoes of 1,000 battlefields faded into memory. But for those who had lived through the mutiny, the sailors who had chosen defiance over blind loyalty, the end of the war did not bring peace. It brought silence, a silence heavier than the roar of cannons. In the shattered ruins of Germany, survivors drifted through the chaos like ghosts. Some returned to their families, if they still had any. Others wandered from town to town, hiding their past, pretending to be ordinary men who had simply followed orders. To admit to mutiny was still dangerous. In a country struggling to rebuild its identity, heroes and traitors were often the same men, separated only by who wrote the history books. Matthias Kessler never spoke publicly of what he had done. The British released him after months of questioning when it became clear that his signal had saved lives. But in the new world that followed, there was no place for men like him, men who had fought not for victory, but for conscience. He moved to Lübeck, working as a mechanic at a small shipyard by the Baltic Sea. Those who met him described him as quiet, polite, but distant. He rarely spoke of the past, and when asked about the war, he would simply shake his head and say, "It was madness." On cold evenings, he would walk to the edge of the harbor and stare out at the horizon, where the wrecks of the old ships still lay beneath the waves. Sometimes fishermen said they saw him whispering to the sea, as if speaking to ghosts. Otto Bauer, too, survived. He spent several years in a British prisoner camp before being released in 1948. He returned to Kiel, now a city rebuilt from ashes. He lived alone, working on the docks until old age. In 1963, he was found dead in his small apartment, a faded naval photo still pinned to the wall. His crew, smiling, unaware of what awaited them. On the back of the photo were 4 words, written in his own hand. We chose to live.
For decades, no one spoke of the mutiny. Official records called it an isolated breakdown in command. The archives of the Kriegsmarine were sanitized, the truth buried under layers of bureaucracy and shame. But history, like the tide, has a way of returning what we tried to hide. In 1987, a German historian named Dr. Lucas Reinhardt uncovered a sealed box in the Federal Archives in Koblenz. Inside were radio logs, interrogation transcripts, and a handwritten note dated April 28, 1945, the day of Kessler's final broadcast. The note read, "Transmit immediately. The fleet will not fight. If this is my last act, let it be for those who still remember what it means to be human." The discovery reignited interest in the Forgotten Rebellion. Newspapers called it the mutiny that died in silence. Television crews came to Kiel, filming documentaries about the ships still rusting at the bottom of the harbor. For the first time, the names of the mutineers were spoken aloud: Matthias Kessler, Otto Bauer, Franz Miller, and others who had vanished into history. But more than the names, it was their message that lingered. A reminder that even in a regime built on fear and obedience, there were still moments of resistance, small, quiet acts of courage that refused to be erased. One journalist later wrote, "They did not win, they did not survive, but they remembered how to say no, and in that they found freedom." In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a small ceremony was held at the harbor in Kiel. The sea was calm, the sky gray. A handful of elderly men stood beside a memorial stone, their coats flapping in the wind. One of them, his hands trembling, placed a small metal badge on the stone, the insignia of the Kriegsmarine. The badge had been broken in half. The inscription on the memorial read simply, "To those who refused the last order."
It was not grand. It was not celebrated. But for those who understood, it was enough. Today, few remember the details of those final days. The names of the ships, the codes, the orders, all fade like ink on wet paper. But what remains is the truth that no regime, no matter how powerful, can command the conscience of every man. The German Navy's secret mutiny did not change the outcome of the war, but it revealed something deeper, a flicker of humanity in a sea of darkness. And as the years pass, the waves continue to wash against the rusting hulls of the lost fleet. The sea keeps their secret, but not their silence. Because if you stand on the docks of Kiel on a quiet night, when the wind is right, you can almost hear it, the whisper of steel, the echo of voices carried on the tide, the murmur of men who chose to live instead of die for madness. The war ended. The Reich fell.
Before the dawn, when the world was wrapped in darkness, a squadron of women took to the skies, armed with nothing but courage and wooden biplanes that barely held together. They were the Night Witches. For the German soldiers on the Eastern Front, the nights would never be safe again. These were not ordinary pilots. They were young, fierce, relentless, and fearless. Flying the antiquated Polykarpov PO-2, slow, fragile, made of wood and canvas, they became a nightmare for the Nazis. Their planes carried little more than bombs, but their strategy carried terror. Silent as shadows, they glided over German camps, engines cut midair, coasting under the moonlight before dropping bombs that shattered the calm. The Nazis called them Nachthexen, night witches. The story begins in 1941 as Hitler's Wehrmacht stormed into the Soviet Union. Cities burned, armies retreated, and despair gripped the Eastern Front. Amid the chaos, the Soviet air forces realized that conventional tactics were failing. Precision bombing runs were too slow. Resources stretched thin. Marina Ryskova, a celebrated aviator, stepped forward. She lobbied Stalin personally, demanding that women be allowed to fly combat missions. At first, her request was laughed at, dismissed as impossible. But Ryskova persisted. 3 all-female regiments were formed, including the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, destined to become legendary. Training was harsh. Flying the PO-2 in bitter winters demanded discipline, skill, and nerves of steel. The pilots learned to navigate by moonlight, to land in open fields without runways, to dodge anti-aircraft fire and evade enemy fighters. Every sortie was a battle against the elements and death itself. The PO-2 was slow, but its slowness became its advantage. Enemy fighters struggled to shoot it down, radar often failed to detect its wooden frame, and its simplicity allowed pilots to focus entirely on daring tactics. The women perfected a terrifying maneuver, approaching the target under darkness, cutting their engines, and gliding silently before dropping bombs that shattered the calm. The Nazis called them Nachthexen, night witches.
The psychological effect on the Nazis was profound. How could an enemy that struck silently and vanished like ghosts be fought? Fear gnawed at every soldier. Sleep became elusive, and every night brought the possibility of sudden death. These women changed the nature of warfare on the Eastern Front. Among them were figures whose names became legend. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the regiment's first commander, led with unwavering discipline and courage. Nadezhda Popova flew over 1,000 missions, defying danger at every turn. Irina Sebrova became a nightmare for the Wehrmacht, precise and daring. The Soviet Union recognized their valor. Many received the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, a rare honor, especially for women in combat during the 1940s. But the cost was high. Lives were lost, and survivors returned haunted by the skies they had conquered and the destruction they had witnessed. The first missions were terrifying. German camps were silent, confident that darkness would provide safety. Then the biplanes appeared, gliding like shadows. Bombs dropped with soft, deadly whispers. Soldiers ran blindly into shelters, searching for the source. The night witches never lingered. They struck, vanished, and left an imprint of fear. Their tactics were simple but brutal. Each pilot carried a few small bombs, but each bomb was meticulously aimed. Sometimes a single bomb could destroy a fuel depot, a supply train, or a command post. Multiple sorties ensured maximum disruption. Flying the Po-2 required skill and courage in equal measure. The engines were underpowered, the planes fragile, prone to freezing mid-flight. One mistake could mean catastrophe. Yet the women learned to exploit every weakness in the aircraft to their advantage. Low speeds allowed for precise drops. Wooden frames made them invisible to radar. The tiny planes could land in fields too small for conventional aircraft. The limitations became their strength. Fear and death were constant companions. Pilots learned to read the wind, to anticipate enemy patrols, to sense anti-aircraft positions. Every night brought new challenges. Some flights ended in tragedy. Engines froze, bombs misfired, planes collided. Yet the women persisted,
driven by patriotism, courage, and the knowledge that every mission weakened the enemy. Their determination became a symbol not only to the Soviet people, but to all those who believed in the power of daring and ingenuity over brute force.
The Night Witches became experts in psychological warfare. Their silent approach, engine cut, gliding through the night, instilled fear in German troops. Every camp had a story of the ghost planes that struck without warning. Rumors spread, morale plummeted, and soldiers slept uneasily, haunted by the thought of wooden biplanes delivering death in the stillness of night. Every sortie was a story of courage, survival, and strategic brilliance. Night after night, the biplanes took off from hidden fields, engines sputtering, wings groaning, carrying nothing but courage and a handful of bombs. The first raids were small, reconnaissance missions designed to test the tactics and the pilots' nerves. German camps were heavily fortified, yet the Night Witches flew low, skimming treetops, hugging the curves of rivers, and approaching their targets undetected. Their methods were unconventional, almost reckless, but the results were undeniable. The Po-2 could not outgun the enemy, could not outfly modern fighters, and could barely carry enough bombs to make a serious impact. Yet the women learned to turn every limitation into an advantage. Bombs were small, but precise. Engines cut, the planes glided silently, and targets were hit with deadly accuracy. Factories, ammunition depots, fuel supplies, and troop concentrations fell victim to these nighttime raids. Each mission disrupted supply lines and created chaos behind enemy lines. One of the earliest recorded raids struck a German command post near the front lines. The pilots had flown multiple sorties that night, fatigue gnawing at their bones, hands numb from cold, and eyes stinging from the winter wind. They descended over the camp like ghosts, engines silent, dropping bombs that detonated with horrifying precision. Soldiers scrambled in panic, realizing too late that there was no aircraft to target, no immediate threat to see. The Night Witches had vanished into the darkness, leaving only smoke, fire, and terror.
As weeks turned into months, the regiment perfected their signature tactic. Approaching at low altitude, they would cut engines, allowing the plane to glide silently over the target. Bombs were released in carefully timed intervals, and immediately after, the engines roared back to life for a hasty retreat. German anti-aircraft guns were largely ineffective against such small, slow-moving targets. Night fighters struggled to intercept them. And yet, the Night Witches faced mortal danger every flight. Collisions, frostbite, engine failures, and sudden storms were constant threats. Each mission was a battle not just against the enemy, but against the very sky itself. Word of the Night Witches spread rapidly through the German lines. Soldiers whispered about the wooden planes that brought death without warning. Officers tried to devise countermeasures, deploying searchlights, radar, and night fighters. None could consistently stop the squadron. Every night, the psychological pressure mounted. Even well-rested soldiers found themselves haunted by the knowledge that, at any moment, the Night Witches could appear above them, dropping bombs silently before disappearing into the darkness. Morale dropped. Fear became a weapon. The pilots themselves endured conditions that would have broken most men. Temperatures in the cockpit often fell well below freezing. The Po-2 had no heater, no armor, no parachutes on early flights. Hands and feet froze. Frostbite was a constant threat. And yet they flew mission after mission. They carried food and maps in small packs, relying on navigational skill and instinct to guide them through the night. Many nights ended with emergency landings in fields, forests, or frozen rivers, risking capture, injury, or death. Among the most daring missions was the raid on Kerch, a heavily defended supply hub. Multiple sorties were flown, each plane carrying a small payload, each pilot risking everything. The enemy had prepared for an attack, with flat guns and machine guns ready,
Yet the squadron executed its plan flawlessly. Bombs rained down in precise succession, destroying fuel supplies and ammunition depots, leaving the base in flames by dawn. Casualties were high on the German side, morale shattered, and the Night Witches returned, exhausted but triumphant.
The legend of Nadezhda Popova grew during these raids. She flew over 1,000 sorties, braving enemy fire, freezing temperatures, and the constant threat of death. Each mission became a testament to human endurance, courage, and ingenuity. Popova and her comrades did not fight for fame. They fought to protect their homeland, to disrupt the enemy, and to prove that courage was not bound by gender. The regiment's success inspired others. Young women across the Soviet Union volunteered, eager to join the Night Witches and take to the skies. Every flight was a story, every raid a chapter in a growing saga of bravery, skill, and tenacity. German soldiers came to fear the night itself, aware that in the darkness, wooden biplanes could strike without warning, leaving only destruction and terror in their wake. Despite the success, loss was inevitable. Every mission carried risks, and some did not return. The regiment mourned quietly, honoring those who had given their lives for their country. Their sacrifice was remembered not just in medals, but in the fear they instilled, the supply lines they destroyed, and the strategic advantage they provided to the Soviet army. The Night Witches became more than pilots. They became symbols, icons of resistance, and embodiments of courage against impossible odds. Every pilot carried a story. Every mission was etched into memory, a mixture of fear, courage, and determination. Among them, Yevdokia Bershanskaya stood out, not only as the regiment's commander, but as a symbol of discipline and unwavering resolve. She coordinated missions, trained new recruits, and flew sorties herself, proving that leadership meant sharing every risk. Her presence inspired confidence in the pilots, a reminder that courage was contagious. Nadezhda Popova, one of the most accomplished pilots, became known for her audacity. On one mission, she flew alone over a German supply line in blizzard conditions. Snow blinded her, frost bit at her fingers and face, and the engine sputtered with every gust of wind. Yet she pressed on, dropping bombs with precision that destroyed ammunition depots and fuel stores. When she returned, her plane battered and frozen, her squadron celebrated not only the victory, but her unyielding spirit.
Irina Sebrova earned the reputation of a ghost. Her tactics were precise, her timing impeccable. She once glided silently over a fortified German camp, cutting her engine at the last possible moment. The enemy never heard her approach. Bombs fell, soldiers scrambled, chaos erupted, and Sebrova vanished into the night. For the Germans, she became a symbol of an enemy they could neither see nor anticipate. Loss shadowed every flight. Engines failed, planes collided, and anti-aircraft fire took its toll. Some missions ended in tragedy. A pilot might disappear into a forest, her plane splintered by gunfire, never to return. Yet even in grief, the regiment persisted. Each fallen comrade strengthened their resolve, reminding the living that their purpose was greater than fear. Their courage was collective, a bond forged in the cold night skies over the Eastern Front. The psychological impact of the Night Witches cannot be overstated. German soldiers began to fear the night itself. Rumors spread of planes that moved like shadows, that struck without sound, that carried death with silent precision. Morale plummeted in camps and command posts. Officers struggled to prepare defenses, but the unpredictability of the Night Witches rendered many strategies ineffective. Fear became a weapon, as potent as any gun or bomb. The regiment adapted continuously. They learned to navigate by landmarks, by stars, and by memory. They flew in pairs, groups, or alone, depending on the mission. Sometimes they carried incendiary bombs, targeting fuel depots and warehouses. Other times they carried small explosives to disrupt supply lines or destroy vehicles. Each sortie was tailored to the enemy's vulnerabilities, exploiting weaknesses that larger, heavier aircraft could not reach. Missions could last hours, with pilots exposed to freezing wind and snow, the roar of the engines mingling with the silence of the night. Exhaustion was constant. Frostbite threatened every extremity. Yet the pilots endured, relying on instinct, training, and sheer determination. Each flight was a test of human endurance, a confrontation with both the enemy and the elements.
The Night Witches' legacy grew with each raid. Their effectiveness inspired other Soviet units, and their tactics were studied and emulated. Yet, it was not just skill that made them formidable. It was courage. Young women, many in their late teens or early 20s, flew into danger repeatedly, understanding that every mission carried the possibility of death. Their bravery reshaped the perception of what women could achieve in war. Every sortie told a story. One pilot described the eerie calm before reaching the target. The world below was quiet, almost peaceful, until bombs fell with sudden violence. Fires erupted, explosions shattered the night, and soldiers ran in panic, searching for the source of terror. Then the plane would retreat, engines roaring back to life, leaving behind a landscape transformed by destruction and fear. Yet even amid triumph, the pilots remained humble. They flew because it was necessary, because the Soviet Union needed them, and because they believed in the righteousness of their mission. Recognition was secondary, survival and success were primary. Still, medals were awarded, names became known, and the legend of the Night Witches grew. By 1943, the Night Witches had grown into a formidable force. The reputation spread across the Eastern Front, whispered in fear by German soldiers, and celebrated by Soviet command. They were no longer a handful of daring women in fragile biplanes. They had become a tactical weapon, a tool of disruption, and a symbol of defiance.
One of their most notable campaigns took place near the Cuban region, where German forces had entrenched supply lines and heavily defended positions. Conventional bombing had failed to break through. The Night Witches, flying low and silent over the front lines, executed a series of night raids that became legendary. Flying in staggered formations, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, they struck with precision, dropping bombs on fuel depots, ammunition stockpiles, and supply trains. Each sortie forced the enemy to scramble, exposing vulnerabilities that would have otherwise remained hidden. The tactics evolved constantly. Early missions had relied on stealth alone, gliding silently over enemy positions. By mid-1943, the pilots incorporated feints, false approaches, and diversionary runs. Sometimes one plane would circle above, drawing anti-aircraft fire, while the other struck from an unexpected direction. Night navigation became a refined skill, combining memorized terrain, celestial navigation, and instinct honed through months of perilous sorties. Weather became both an enemy and an ally. Snowstorms, fog, and low clouds concealed their approach, yet threatened to ground them entirely. Pilots learned to read the wind and the stars, adjusting flight paths mid-air. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant companions, yet the women pressed on, driven by duty and an understanding that every successful sortie weakened the enemy and strengthened their homeland. The regiment's endurance was unmatched. Some pilots flew multiple missions in a single night, returning to base to refuel and rearm, only to take off again within hours. The pace was exhausting, the conditions harsh, yet their success was undeniable. German forces could not rest, could not predict their movements,
and could not fight an enemy that attacked under the cover of darkness with such precision.
The psychological dimension of their operations became increasingly apparent. Fear among the German troops was pervasive. Soldiers slept lightly. Officers fretted over every rustle in the trees, every distant engine hum. Even when no bombs fell, the expectation of attack weighed heavily. Entire units were demoralized simply by the anticipation of the Night Witch's presence. Their weapon was as much terror as ordnance, as much perception as firepower. Among the pilots, camaraderie and trust were paramount. Every mission depended on precise coordination and mutual reliance. If one plane failed, the others had to adapt immediately. Every sortie demanded perfect execution. Young women in fragile aircraft faced the enemy head-on, relying on training, instinct, and each other. Their bravery inspired not only fellow pilots, but also soldiers on the ground who understood that they were witnessing history in motion. The Night Witches also adapted to new threats. German attempts to intercept them with faster fighters were countered by low-altitude maneuvers, terrain masking, and unpredictable flight paths. Anti-aircraft batteries were rendered less effective through precise timing, careful altitude control, and rapid retreats. Each encounter forced both sides to adapt, creating a deadly game of strategy and skill played out over the darkness of the night skies. By the winter of 1943-44, the regiment had flown thousands of sorties, destroyed countless supply points, and contributed significantly to the Soviet war effort. Their actions allowed ground troops to advance, disrupted enemy operations, and instilled a pervasive fear that could not be quantified. The Night Witches were more than pilots. They were an elite instrument of psychological warfare, precision strikes, and relentless endurance. Recognition came slowly but surely. Medals were awarded, commendations delivered, and their names recorded in military history. Yet, the pilots remained grounded in duty rather than fame. They continued to fly, knowing that their mission was ongoing and that every night presented new dangers. Each sortie carried the weight of lives, strategy, and survival. Each return to base was a temporary respite before the next mission.
Through these campaigns, the Night Witches solidified their legacy. They proved that courage, ingenuity, and determination could overcome technological inferiority. Wooden biplanes against modern fighters became symbols of human resilience, skill, and audacity. Enemy soldiers whispered tales of their appearance, flight patterns, and silent glides. Their legends spread beyond the front lines, becoming a testament to what could be achieved when fearlessness met opportunity. By 1944, the Night Witches had become an unstoppable force of precision and terror in the skies. Their experience had sharpened into near-perfect execution, each pilot understanding instinctively how to navigate the night, evade the enemy, and strike with deadly accuracy. Their operations were no longer isolated raids. They were coordinated assaults that disrupted entire German supply networks, paralyzed forward units, and enabled Soviet ground advances. One of the most daring operations took place during the siege of Crimea. German forces had fortified their positions, anticipating attacks from conventional bombers. Yet the Night Witches, flying their fragile PO-2s, executed a series of night sorties that became the stuff of legend. Flying in tight formations, often only tens of meters above the ground, they dropped their bombs on ammunition depots, fuel storage sites, and troop encampments. Each flight was a calculated risk, every maneuver dictated by months of experience and an unwavering commitment to precision. The pilots had mastered timing to an extraordinary degree. They learned to glide silently over enemy positions, sometimes cutting engines at the last possible moment, letting the wind carry their planes to the target. German soldiers would hear nothing until explosions tore through the night. Some pilots would circle back, sometimes 2 or 3 times, adjusting altitude and trajectory to maximize damage. The result was a devastating combination of surprise, accuracy, and psychological pressure that the enemy could neither predict nor counter. Amid these missions, individual acts of heroism became legendary. Nadezhda Popova, flying with frostbitten hands and numb fingers, once navigated through a blizzard to hit a critical fuel depot. She returned hours later, her plane covered in ice, barely able to land. Yet the destruction she had wrought crippled the German supply chain for days. Irina Sabrova, known for her ghost-like precision, executed multiple sorties in a single night, leaving entire camps in chaos before dawn broke. Their stories were not just of strategy, but of endurance, courage, and relentless dedication to the cause.
The cost of these missions was severe. Engines failed, bombs misfired, and some pilots never returned. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion were constant threats. Every takeoff and landing carried the possibility of disaster, yet the women pressed on, understanding that each mission was critical to the larger war effort. Their determination became both a symbol and a weapon, striking fear into the hearts of the enemy while inspiring their comrades. The Night Witches' final campaigns coincided with the Soviet advance into Eastern Europe. They flew hundreds of sorties, often in extreme weather conditions, targeting bridges, railways, supply depots, and troop concentrations. German forces, demoralized by continuous harassment, struggled to maintain control of their lines. Even heavily fortified positions were vulnerable to these nocturnal attacks. The Night Witches had transformed the very concept of air warfare, proving that precision, courage, and psychological impact could outweigh sheer firepower. As the war drew closer to its end, the pilots faced both triumph and tragedy. Some were decorated with the highest honors, their bravery recognized at the national level. Others fell in the line of duty, their sacrifices silently honored by comrades who understood the peril of each flight. The regiment endured, a blend of skill, strategy, and unbreakable resolve, proving that even the most fragile aircraft could deliver decisive blows when guided by fearless pilots. The psychological toll on the enemy had reached its zenith. Entire garrisons reported sleepless nights, panicked movements, and eroding morale. Officers attempted countermeasures, deploying faster fighters, searchlights, and anti-aircraft artillery, yet the Night Witches adapted seamlessly. Their experience, ingenuity, and determination made them virtually untouchable. Their legend was no longer rumor, it was a documented reality that shaped German strategy and instilled terror across the Eastern Front. When the war finally neared its conclusion, the regiment had flown thousands of sorties, delivered tens of thousands of bombs, and suffered losses that weighed heavily on every pilot. The impact of their missions extended beyond tactical victories. They became symbols of resistance, courage, and the capacity of human beings to confront overwhelming odds with ingenuity and determination. The Night Witches had not only changed the course of battles, they had changed the perception of what women could achieve in combat.
Their legacy endured long after the war. Young pilots studied their tactics, historians documented their campaigns, and their stories inspired generations. The Night Witches had proven that bravery, skill, and unwavering resolve could leave an indelible mark on history, transforming fragile wooden biplanes into instruments of terror, strategy, and inspiration. When the guns fell silent and the war came to an end, the Night Witches returned from the skies that had defined their lives for years. They descended from fragile biplanes that had carried them through darkness, danger, and destruction, stepping into a world forever changed. The enemy had been defeated, yet the cost of victory was heavy. Friends lost, comrades gone, and memories of nights spent in freezing cockpits etched permanently into their minds. The Soviet Union recognized their extraordinary contribution. Medals were awarded, promotions granted, and their names etched into military history.
Heroes of the Soviet Union, a distinction rarely bestowed, honored pilots like Nadezhda Popova, Irina Sabrova, and Yevdokia Bersonskaya. Yet their true reward was less tangible. The knowledge that their bravery had altered the course of battles, disrupted supply lines, and saved countless lives on the ground. Despite the recognition, the Night Witches were remarkably humble. Many avoided the spotlight, choosing quiet lives after the war. The experiences they endured, facing frostbite, enemy fire, and death night after night, left a mark that could not be erased. They often spoke of the war not in terms of glory, but in terms of duty, survival, and camaraderie. Their shared experiences bonded them for life, creating connections that transcended rank, fame, or recognition.
Historians, writers, and filmmakers began to document their story, ensuring that the legend would endure. Their tactics, gliding silently over enemy positions, precise bombing in fragile aircraft, and the psychological impact on the enemy, were studied and admired. The Night Witches became icons of human ingenuity, illustrating that courage, discipline, and daring could reshape the battlefield. Some pilots returned to aviation, training the next generation of aviators, sharing lessons learned through thousands of sorties. Others pursued entirely different lives, carrying the memories of the war silently within them. Theirs was a generation forged in adversity, tested in extreme conditions, and transformed by experiences that few could imagine. The human element of their story remained the most compelling. They were young women, often barely adults, confronting death in the darkness. They navigated fear, fatigue, and uncertainty with unwavering resolve. Every mission demanded skill, courage, and mental fortitude. Every return to base was a triumph of survival, strategy, and human endurance. The Night Witches demonstrated that heroism was not defined by the size of the weapon, but by the strength of spirit. Even decades later, their story resonates. Museums, books, and documentaries celebrate their achievements. Pilots continue to honor their tactics and courage. And for those who study the Eastern Front of World War II, the legend of the Night Witches serves as a reminder that the human spirit, ingenuity, and bravery can turn the most fragile tools into instruments of profound impact. Their biplanes, now silent in museums, once soared as ghosts of the night. The fields they flew over, once scarred by their precision bombing, now bear no trace of the terror unleashed from above. Yet the memory endures, not just in history books, but in the collective imagination of all who understand what it means to confront fear with courage, danger with skill, and the impossible with relentless determination. The Night Witches did not simply participate in the war. They redefined it. They transformed wooden biplanes into instruments of strategy, precision, and psychological warfare. They demonstrated that bravery knows no gender, that skill can outweigh technology, and that courage, above all, leaves an indelible mark on history.
Even today, their story inspires pilots, soldiers, and civilians alike. It reminds us that heroes can emerge in the unlikeliest of forms, that courage is often silent, and that history is shaped not only by the strongest weapons, but by the bravest hearts. The Night Witches remain eternal, haunting the skies of history as symbols of fearlessness, ingenuity, and unyielding resolve. The story of the Night Witches is not only a tale of war, but a study of human courage in its purest form. They taught the world that the measure of a soldier is not found in size, armor, or firepower, but in daring, skill, and unshakable resolve. Flying fragile wooden biplanes against heavily armed and modernized enemy aircraft required more than training. It required faith in oneself, in one's comrades, and in the mission.
Their influence extends beyond the boundaries of World War II. Modern aviators study their tactics, understanding the value of stealth, precision, and psychological impact. Their methods, refined in the dead of night over enemy lines, reveal lessons that transcend time. Adaptability in the face of danger, ingenuity under pressure, and courage when failure is not an option. The Night Witches also changed perceptions of women in combat. They proved that gender does not define capability, and that courage and determination are universal. Across the Soviet Union and beyond, young women saw the possibilities opened by their example. They became pioneers in aviation, heroes in military history, and enduring symbols of equality in courage and skill. Yet their story is more than medals and accolades. It is the story of fear confronted and overcome, of exhaustion endured, and of missions executed against impossible odds. Every sortie into the night demanded not only technical skill, but the ability to confront mortality, to push beyond personal limits, and to embrace uncertainty with resolve. Their courage was both practical and philosophical, a manifestation of the human capacity to rise above fear. History remembers the Night Witches not just for the destruction they wrought, but for the hope they inspired. Their presence reassured allies, disrupted enemies, and reshaped strategies. They remind us that impact is not measured solely by weapons, but by determination, creativity, and resolve. Theirs was a war waged as much in spirit and mind as in bombs and gunfire.
In reflecting on their achievements, one is struck by the balance of fragility and strength. Wooden biplanes, vulnerable and archaic, became tools of extraordinary effect when guided by courageous hands. Pilots who faced frostbite, storms, and anti-aircraft fire, who navigated in darkness with nothing but instinct and skill, turned their vulnerability into an advantage. Their story embodies the paradox of power. Sometimes the most fragile instruments, when wielded with courage and precision, can change the course of history. The legacy of the Night Witches endures in modern military doctrine, in the stories of bravery passed down through generations, and in the inspiration they provide to all who confront daunting challenges. They're remembered not just for their missions, but for their relentless spirit, their ingenuity, and the courage to confront the impossible with unwavering determination. In the quiet moments after the war, when engines were silent and biplanes grounded, the memory of the Night Witches lived on. The ghostly flights over the Eastern Front became legend, recorded in history books, retold in documentaries, and celebrated in museums. Yet the true impact lies in the human spirit they embodied, the ability to confront fear, defy limitations, and rise above the most harrowing circumstances. The Night Witches remain eternal in memory, a testament to what can be achieved when courage meets skill, when ingenuity meets determination, and when ordinary humans face extraordinary challenges. Their story is a reminder that history is shaped not only by leaders and armies, but by individuals who dare to defy convention, confront danger, and leave an indelible mark on the world. Even decades later, the skies over the Eastern Front seem to whisper their presence, a silent tribute to those who glided through darkness, transformed fear into strategy, and wrote their names in the annals of history. They remind us that heroism comes in many forms, and that courage, when sustained over time and directed with precision, can echo across generations. The Night Witches flew not for glory, but for duty. They flew not for recognition, but for victory. And through their courage, skill, and perseverance, they achieved a legacy that endures beyond time, beyond war, and beyond memory. A legacy that continues to inspire all who dare to reach for the skies.
The first light of January 1st, 1945, crept over the frozen fields of Europe like a ghost. The snow was thin, brittle, and colorless, and the dawn brought with it no promise of a new beginning. For most of the continent, it was simply another morning in a war that had already gone on too long. But for the men of the Luftwaffe, that morning would mark the end, not just of a mission, but of an era. The war had turned against Germany long ago. The skies that once trembled under the roar of Messerschmitts and Stukas were now ruled by Allied fighters. American Mustangs, British Spitfires, and Thunderbolts ranged across the continent at will, hunting trains, convoys, and anything that dared to move. The German pilots who had once been feared across Europe now flew in desperation, few in number, low on fuel, and facing an enemy that outnumbered them in the air, on the ground, and in the factories. Yet, in the final months of 1944, as the Allied armies pushed into the western borders of the Reich, a plan began to take shape inside the corridors of what was left of the German High Command. It was bold, reckless, and rooted in a fading dream of turning back the tide. They called it Operation Bodenplatte. The objective was simple in theory: destroy the Allied air power stationed in Belgium and Holland in one surprise attack. If successful, the Luftwaffe could buy time for the army fighting in the Ardennes, where Hitler's last great offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was raging. It was to be a strike worthy of the old days. Hundreds of aircraft, taking off in the freezing dawn, sweeping low across the front lines, catching the Allies unprepared. A strike that might remind the world that Germany still had claws. But it was built on fantasy. The Luftwaffe of 1945 was not the force of 1940. The veterans of the Battle of Britain were dead, captured or grounded. Fuel was so scarce that even training flights were rationed. Many of the men assigned to fly the operation were barely out of flight school. Some had never even fired their guns in combat. The once proud airfields of the Reich were now little more than mud and wreckage, their hangars half buried in snow and ash. Still, orders came down from above. Every available fighter group in the West, the Jagdgeschwader, would take part. Nearly 1,000 planes were to fly. It was madness. But in the Third Reich's dying winter, madness was all that remained.
In the pre-dawn darkness, engines coughed to life across airfields from northern Germany to Holland. Mechanics worked by lantern light, scraping ice from wings with their bare hands. Pilots climbed into cockpits, shivering in thin leather jackets. Some said quiet prayers, others lit cigarettes and stared into the dark, knowing this might be their final flight. At a small airstrip near Cologne, a young pilot named Karl-Heinz Ebert adjusted his gloves and checked his instruments. He was 21 years old, and he had already survived more than most. His squadron had been nearly wiped out on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. They had flown missions against American bombers, diving into walls of flak and fire. He had seen friends vanish in seconds, their planes becoming streaks of black smoke against the winter sky. Yet he believed in the mission. He believed somehow that if this attack succeeded, it might change everything. When the signal came, the roar of engines rolled across the countryside. One by one, the aircraft lifted into the pale morning sky. Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, sleek and deadly against the frost. The air vibrated with power and purpose. Below, villagers looked up and wondered if the old days had returned. As the formations turned west, the pilots dropped to treetop fight, flying low to avoid Allied radar. They skimmed over rivers and frozen fields, over the ruins of cities that once glowed with light. The plan depended entirely on surprise. The Allies would never expect such an attack on New Year's morning when most pilots and crews would still be asleep. But as they flew deeper into enemy territory, cracks in the plan began to show. Navigation was difficult in the winter haze. Many pilots were using outdated maps. Some had been given the wrong target coordinates altogether. German anti-aircraft gunners, unaware of the operation, opened fire on their own planes as they crossed the front lines. Still, they pressed on.
At the same time, across Belgium, Allied airfields lay quiet. The night before had been one of celebration. Pilots had toasted the new year with laughter and brandy, confident that victory was close. Their planes sat in neat rows, canopies frosted, engines silent. The war, it seemed, was nearly over. Then came the sound, distant at first, like thunder rolling across the sky. A mechanic at Osh Airfield looked up and frowned. The sound grew louder, sharper, the unmistakable roar of aircraft engines. He expected to see friendly planes returning from patrol. Instead, dark shapes burst from the mist. The first wave of German fighters came in low, guns flashing. Bullets tore through hangars and fuel trucks, sending plumes of fire into the sky. Ground crews scattered. Pilots sprinted for their planes. Bombs exploded along the runways. In seconds, Osh was an inferno. At Brussels, the scene was no different. Focke-Wulf 190s and 10-9s raked the field with gunfire, shredding parked Spitfires and Mustangs before they could even move. One pilot barely managed to take off before being hit, his plane bursting into flames as it cleared the trees. For the first time in years, the Luftwaffe ruled the air, if only for a few minutes. The attack spread across a front of hundreds of miles. At Eindhoven, at Melsbroek, at St. Trond, Allied bases burned. Smoke rose into the cold morning sky. But the illusion could not last. The Allies, stunned at first, began to respond with terrifying speed. American and British fighters scrambled from every direction, roaring into the chaos. The element of surprise evaporated. At Osh, the famed 352nd Fighter Group, the blue-nosed bastards of Bodny, launched into the fight. Major John C. Meyer led the charge, his Mustang climbing hard through the smoke. The first German he saw went down in flames within seconds, then another. The sky was filled with twisting contrails and black bursts of cannon fire. German pilots, low on fuel and unfamiliar with the terrain, found themselves trapped. Many tried to break off and flee east, but Allied planes were already waiting. Dogfights erupted at treetop height. Engines screamed. Planes collided. Wings sheared away. By mid-morning, the battle had turned into a massacre. Across Belgium and Holland, the Luftwaffe was dying in the air. Hundreds of aircraft, some of the last Germany could field, were shot down or destroyed on the ground. Many crashed before even reaching their targets. Others simply disappeared into the winter clouds, never to be seen again. By noon, the sky was silent once more. At the Allied bases, smoke still hung in the air, but the damage, though severe, was not crippling. Within days, replacements arrived and operations resumed. For the Germans, there would be no such recovery. Reports filtered back to Berlin throughout the afternoon. They were chaotic, contradictory, and horrifying. Out of nearly 1,000 aircraft launched, more than 300 had been lost. Hundreds of pilots were dead or missing. The Luftwaffe's last trained veterans had been thrown into the fire and consumed. In the Reich Chancellery, Göring raged and denied. He blamed his commanders, the weather, even the bravery of his own men. But the truth was unavoidable. The Luftwaffe was finished. That morning, in a single act of desperation, Germany's Air Force had destroyed itself. For the rest of the war, Allied bombers flew to Berlin without fear. Fighters swept across the skies unchallenged.
The once mighty symbol of the Reich's power, the Black Cross on silver wings, had become a relic of a dream that had burned itself to ash. And as the last German planes limped home that afternoon, smoke trailing from their engines, the men who flew them knew it. They had given everything they had left, and it had not been enough.
That was the day the Luftwaffe died. In the hours that followed the attack, the wreckage of the Luftwaffe's last gamble was scattered across the fields and forests of Western Europe. Burned fuselages lay half buried in snow. Smoke curled lazily from craters where aircraft had struck the ground at impossible speed. The faint smell of fuel and frost hung in the air, the dying breath of an air force that had once ruled the continent. Those who survived returned to their bases in silence. Pilots landed on broken runways, their planes riddled with bullet holes, landing gear shattered, canopies cracked by gunfire. Some climbed out and simply sat on the wings, staring at the horizon in disbelief. Others walked among the wrecks, searching for the faces of men who would never come back. The officers tried to count the losses, but numbers meant little now. Whole squadrons had vanished. Experienced leaders were gone, replaced by frightened boys who no longer believed in victory. Mechanics worked in stunned quiet, dragging wrecks aside, patching holes that would never see flight again. At one airfield, a sergeant watched as his commanding officer returned alone. The man's aircraft barely held together, its tail shredded by cannon shells. When the engine died, he didn't move. The sergeant approached, opened the cockpit, and found him sitting motionless, staring straight ahead. There were tears frozen on his cheeks. Word of the disaster spread slowly at first, then all at once. By the afternoon of January 1st, it reached every level of the German command. The reports came in waves, at least 300 aircraft destroyed, nearly 200 more damaged beyond repair. More than 250 pilots killed or missing. For a nation that could barely train a handful of replacements each month, it was a loss from which there would be no return.
The Allies quickly realized the truth. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything it had left into one desperate strike and failed. In the days that followed, the skies over Europe changed forever. The Allied air forces, which had already dominated the war in the air, now moved without resistance. Bombers flew deep into Germany, striking oil refineries, rail hubs, and cities with impunity. Fighter squadrons roamed freely, destroying trains, vehicles, and even lone soldiers on the roads. For the German troops on the ground, the change was immediate and brutal. Every movement now had to be made under the cover of darkness. Convoys moved only at night. By day, any sound of an engine overhead sent men diving for cover. The Luftwaffe had once been their shield. Now it was gone. The psychological blow was immense. For years, German propaganda had spoken of the invincible air arm of the Reich, the mighty eagle whose wings stretched over Europe. But now, even the most loyal soldiers could see the truth. The eagle was dead. Inside Germany, the once proud cities that had been home to aircraft factories and training centers became graveyards of industry. In Augsburg, where Messerschmitt had built its famous fighters, the assembly lines were silent. Allied bombs had reduced the factories to twisted steel. In Bremen, Focke-Wulf plants lay in ruins. The few surviving engineers worked in underground tunnels, piecing together parts from wreckage, knowing that nothing they built could ever turn the tide. Fuel was the final nail in the coffin. By early 1945, Germany's synthetic fuel plants had been bombed beyond repair. Even if new planes could be built, there was nothing to fly them. The few operational aircraft left were grounded more often than not, their engines run only for minutes at a time to save what little aviation fuel remained. The Luftwaffe's pilots, once the elite of Europe, now found themselves reduced to defending the skies with wooden gliders and makeshift rockets. Some flew the new MiG-262 jet fighter, a marvel of engineering that came too late to matter.
It was faster than any Allied plane, but there were too few of them and too little fuel to use them effectively. The miracle weapon that might have changed the war became just another casualty of timing.
For the men who had fought since the early days, the realization came slowly, painfully. They had begun the war as conquerors, sweeping across Poland, France, Norway, and the Low Countries in a storm of wings and fire. They had believed in invincibility, in destiny, in the unstoppable power of the German sky. Now they looked up and saw only contrails, American, British, and Canadian, tracing white lines across the heavens they once owned. Some refused to accept it. In scattered pockets, pilots continued to fight, launching desperate interception missions against bomber formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. They flew into those battles knowing the odds, knowing that even a single victory would change nothing. Many never returned. One Allied pilot later wrote of watching a lone Me-109 attack a formation of bombers over the Rhine. The German came in head-on, firing until his guns jammed, then kept coming. He slammed into one of the bombers and vanished in flame. The pilot's name was never known. The act itself summed up what the Luftwaffe had become: bravery without hope, sacrifice without result. In Berlin, Goering's once glorious Luftwaffe headquarters had become a place of silence. The grand offices that had once echoed with boasts and laughter now held only whispers. Staff officers avoided eye contact. Messages went unanswered. Even the portrait of the Reichsmarschall seemed to stare down accusingly from the wall. When news of Bodenplatte's failure reached Hitler, the response was predictable: rage, denial, and blame. He accused the pilots of cowardice, the generals of incompetence, the weather of betrayal. He refused to accept that the Luftwaffe was dead. In his world, defeat did not exist, only disobedience.
As January faded into February, the wreckage of Operation Bodenplatte was still being cleared from the fields. Farmers hauled burned fuselages into ditches. Children played among the twisted metal, unaware of the ghosts that lingered there. The bodies of pilots were buried where they fell, their names carved into makeshift crosses that the wind soon carried away. In one small village in Belgium, a farmer found a crashed Messerschmitt weeks after the battle. The pilot's body was still strapped in the cockpit. On his lap was a small photograph of his family, a wife and a baby. On the back, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Für immer," forever. That photograph would later be placed in a local museum, a silent testament to the human cost of a war fought beyond reason. The Luftwaffe had died not just in battle, but in spirit, undone by arrogance, exhaustion, and the relentless tide of a war that could no longer be won. Yet, even in its final moments, there was something tragic and human in its fall. The men who flew that morning did not do so out of hatred or fanaticism. Many flew because they had no choice, because it was all they had ever known. They flew because the sky, once their kingdom, still called to them, even as it became their grave. The weeks after the failure of Operation Bodenplatte passed in a blur of smoke and surrender. Winter tightened its grip on Europe. The forests of the Ardennes, where the last German offensive had once thundered forward, now lay silent, except for the rumble of Allied armor rolling east. Every mile the Allies advanced, the horizon grew emptier of German aircraft. The Luftwaffe, which had once darkened the skies with its numbers, had vanished into the cold. By February 1945, Allied intelligence reported that German air activity over the Western Front had fallen by almost 90%. A few scattered flights appeared, lone reconnaissance planes, a handful of Me-262 jets streaking across the clouds, but nothing remained of the vast formations that had once terrorized Europe. The air war, which once was the beating heart of the Reich's military power, had become a whisper.
For the Germans who survived, life became a routine of endurance. Bases that had once buzzed with hundreds of aircraft now sheltered a few broken machines, scavenged for parts. Mechanics drained fuel from wrecks to keep a single plane airborne. Pilots trained in classrooms because there was no gasoline to fly. The proud Luftwaffe wings, stitched to their tunics, had become symbols of a vanished world. At night, when the bombers came, those same men huddled in bunkers with the civilians they once swore to protect from the air. They listened as the Allied waves passed overhead, the earth trembling with every detonation. Some of them wept, others simply closed their eyes and waited for it to end. The empire that had promised them glory now gave them only ruin. In March, the Allies crossed the Rhine. The last natural barrier of Germany's western frontier fell, and the sky above it was thick with Allied aircraft. Fighter bombers circled like hawks, attacking bridges, trains, and columns of retreating troops. They moved so freely that German soldiers began calling them the Angels of Death. To the infantry below, the sound of Allied engines meant inevitable defeat. Meanwhile, what remained of the Luftwaffe fought in fragments. Small groups of Me-262 jets, commanded by aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Nowotny's former comrades, tried to challenge the Allied bombers. They struck fast and hard, then disappeared before escorting fighters could respond. For a brief moment, the jet offered a glimpse of what might have been. It was faster than anything the Allies could field, capable of outrunning pursuit and shredding bomber formations with its cannons. But there were never enough. Pilots lacked experience, and engines failed after only a few hours of flight. Each victory was paid for in irreplaceable machines. By April, the jets themselves became targets before they even left the ground. Allied fighter bombers watched the runways, attacking the sleek silver shapes the moment they appeared. Pilots who had once raced through clouds of flak now found themselves trapped in their own hangars. Some never took off again.
In the final days of the Reich, the last generation of German pilots flew missions that bordered on the suicidal. They intercepted bomber streams over burning cities, trying to protect people who no longer believed salvation was possible. A few of them flew rickety training planes armed with a single machine gun. Others launched from hidden strips carved out of forests, hoping to surprise an enemy who no longer even noticed their presence. On April 25th, Berlin was surrounded. Soviet artillery thundered from the outskirts, and the sky above the capital was filled with the black smoke of thousands of fires. A handful of Luftwaffe aircraft still tried to reach the city, mostly small courier flights bringing messages and supplies. One such mission carried a young pilot named Hans Eisenreich. He was 19. His orders were to fly into Tempelhof Airport with a bag of dispatches from the front. When he approached the city, anti-aircraft fire from both sides filled the sky. He made it through, landed on a runway cracked by shell fire, and found the airport already abandoned. He turned his plane around and took off again into the smoke, never to be seen afterward. His name would later appear on the list of the last Luftwaffe pilots missing in action. Inside the city, the Air Defense headquarters continued to send orders long after there were no planes left to obey them. Radios crackled with meaningless codes, requests for support that would never come. The officers stayed at their desks until the power failed, and then they wrote reports by candlelight, recording the end of their own service with bureaucratic precision. When Berlin finally fell on May 2nd, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist. Its surviving members surrendered alongside the remnants of the army and navy. Hangars across Germany stood empty, their doors blown open by the wind. In the days that followed, Allied soldiers walked among the ruins, marveling at the technology scattered before them. Jet fighters, rocket engines, strange prototypes that hinted at a future beyond war. But to the victors, they were only trophies. To the defeated, they were reminders of potential wasted in pursuit of madness. The war in Europe ended officially on May 8, 1945. That morning, the sky over Germany was clear. No bombers, no dogfights, no sirens.
just silence. In that silence, the legacy of the Luftwaffe lingered, a mixture of awe and sorrow. It had begun the war as a symbol of innovation and dominance, born from a nation obsessed with speed and precision. It ended as a monument to exhaustion and futility.
Historians would later debate the exact moment the Luftwaffe truly died. Some would point to the defeat over Britain in 1940, when the myth of invincibility first cracked. Others would name the attrition battles of 1943, when the skies above Germany turned into killing grounds for bomber crews and defenders alike. But for those who lived through it, the answer was simpler. It died on the first morning of the new year, when hundreds of planes lifted off in hope and returned in flames. Everything after that was only an echo. Years later, when Europe rebuilt and the world moved on, the story of that morning became a lesson told in classrooms and museums. Photographs of burned aircraft lined the walls of exhibits. Veterans spoke of courage and futility, of skill wasted by arrogance. The Luftwaffe's fall became a symbol of how even the most formidable power can collapse under the weight of its own ambition. For the survivors, life after the war was a quiet struggle. Some became engineers in the new Germany, helping to design civilian aircraft. Others never flew again, haunted by memories of fire and falling sky. A few wrote memoirs, their pages filled not with excuses but with exhaustion, a confession of how far pride had led them astray. Decades later, one former pilot was asked what he remembered most about the day of the Great Attack. He paused for a long time before answering. He said it wasn't the gunfire or the explosions he remembered, but the light, the pale winter sun glinting off the wings of hundreds of aircraft as they rose into the sky together for the last time. For a brief moment, he said, it looked beautiful. Then it was gone. That image remained etched into his memory, a sky filled with promise turning to ash within hours. It was the story of the Luftwaffe itself, condensed into a single sunrise. In the quiet that followed the war, the airfields of Germany became graveyards. From above, they looked like frozen scars across the land. Rows of rusting aircraft, their wings crumpled, their insignias fading beneath the rain. The wind moved through them like a ghost, whistling softly through broken fuselages that once carried the dreams of conquest. The Luftwaffe, once the sharpest weapon of the Reich, had become a collection of twisted metal and forgotten names.
In occupied zones, Allied engineers cataloged the remnants. They walked the runways with notebooks in hand, studying the Me-262 jets, the V-1 flying bombs, the wrecks of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. Each discovery felt like a glimpse into a world that had almost rewritten the laws of war. They marveled at the ingenuity, the swept wings, the jet engines, the rockets, and shuddered at what they represented. These machines had been built with brilliance, but flown in blindness. They were the offspring of genius and delusion intertwined. In Nuremberg, the surviving leaders of the Luftwaffe faced judgment. Hermann Göring, once the architect of Germany's air power, stood in the dock draped in the weight of failure. He had risen from World War I ace to Reichsmarschall, his reputation once towering over Europe. Now, stripped of his medals, he listened as prosecutors recited the list of crimes committed in his name. The terror bombings, the slave labor, the blind obedience to a dictator's madness. His arrogance faltered for the first time. Behind him sat men who had once commanded thousands, their uniforms replaced by plain gray coats, their eyes fixed on the floor. The Luftwaffe, which had sworn eternal loyalty to the Führer, was now a memory on trial. But the story of its fall was more than the story of its leaders. It was the story of an idea that believed technology alone could guarantee victory. The Luftwaffe had been built on speed, precision, and daring, yet it had ignored endurance, supply, and strategy.
When the war stretched into years, its brilliance collapsed under its own perfectionism. Pilots were trained faster than they could be properly prepared. Aircraft were built faster than they could be maintained. Every success carried within it the seed of exhaustion. By the time the jets appeared, there was no fuel left to fly them. By the time new pilots took their seats, there were no veterans left to teach them. That was how empires die, not in one explosion, but through the slow erosion of their own foundations. And when the end comes, it often feels sudden, as if the collapse had happened in a single day. January 1st, 1945, was that day for the Luftwaffe, the moment when years of strain finally broke into disaster. On that morning, they had gambled everything for one last show of strength. By nightfall, the sky belonged to their enemies forever.
As the world rebuilt, the lessons of that collapse shaped a new age. The Allies studied German designs and carried their discoveries into the jet age. The Cold War would soon divide the skies again, but never in the same way. The new generation of air forces learned from the Luftwaffe's mistakes, that no machine, however advanced, could replace human judgment. That courage without purpose was tragedy. That air power without strategy was just noise, fading in the clouds. In the post-war years, a few surviving pilots returned to flying, not as warriors, but as teachers. They trained civilian aviators, built gliders, and spoke quietly of the past. Many never mentioned the war at all. When asked what they had learned, one of them said, "We learned how not to fight a war again." His words carried the weight of all those who had seen the sky turn from triumph to tomb. As the decades passed, the ruins of airfields were overtaken by grass and silence. Children played among the old hangars, unaware of the ghosts beneath their feet. Museums began to collect the relics, the flight jackets, the photographs, the shattered propellers, and with them, the stories. Visitors walked among them in awe, wondering how such beauty could have served such destruction. The Luftwaffe's legacy became a paradox, a marvel of engineering, a failure of humanity.
And yet, among historians, there remains a strange respect for the men who flew. Not for what they fought for, but for how they flew. Against odds, against time, against a sky that turned on them. They were victims of their own myth, trapped inside the machine they built. When the myth died, they fell with it. In one photograph, taken on the morning of January 1st, 1945, a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s can be seen lifting off from a snow-covered airfield. The sun is low, casting long shadows across the frost. The pilots cannot know it, but many of them will never return. The image captures a moment of grace before destruction, a nation's final heartbeat before silence. That single frame, frozen in time, tells the story better than words ever could. For the world, the day the Luftwaffe died was not just the end of an air force. It was the end of an age, the end of belief in the invincible machine, the flawless strategy, the perfect weapon. It proved that no empire, no matter how mighty its engines, can outfly the consequences of its own ambition. When the last veterans passed away, their stories became history. The skies they once filled with war became routes for peace. Commercial jets now trace the same paths their bombers once followed. London to Berlin, Paris to Frankfurt, only now carrying passengers instead of payloads. The sound of engines still echoes, but its meaning has changed. Where once it brought fear, it now brings connection. The sky, once a battlefield, became a bridge. And yet somewhere in the vast archives of wartime footage, the images remain. The black and white film of aircraft lifting into a gray dawn, the radio crackle of doomed missions, the names written in logs that no one reads anymore. They are all that's left of the day when an empire's wings were broken by its own design. The day the Luftwaffe died was not the end of flight. It was the beginning of understanding.
In its fall, humanity learned that power without conscience is a sky without horizon, vast, brilliant, and empty.